Good morning, dearest friends. Today is Friday, January 14th, the 12th of Shvat. We are gathered here to study the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. And Baruch Hashem, we're covering good ground. We're already in the 11th chapter of Masechet Shabbat. And we are on Tzadik Zayin Amud Beis, that's 97b. And in just a moment, we'll be on 98a. And yes, so we're in Perek HaZorek, the chapter that's talking about throwing and other variations and interesting hypotheticals where we might be interacting with more than two domains. So the trademark act of Hoitza'ah, which will be very broadly describing as causing an item to move from one rishus to the other in a way that's prohibited according to the laws of Shabbos. But what happens when you have three domains? Or what if you have other kinds of creative and unexpected domains? And so that's really been what our Mishnah or what our Gemara and Mishnah have been talking about. If you cause an item to travel from a private domain to another private domain passing through a public domain. But the Gemara in its analysis of the Mishnah also talks about the reverse, from one public domain to the other, which introduces the broader question, and that's really going to be the springboard of today's conversation, which is every public domain created equal? Is it plausible that a space that we would conceive to be a public domain might actually be a private domain because of additional factors, structures, and the like? That's the very abstract. But in practice, the bulk of today's discussion is going to be imagining the way the wagons that transported the items of the Mishkan worked. And the reason why that is relevant is, if you recall the Mishnah, the wagons are an integral part of the base notion of carrying Hoitzah transportation. And because whatever happened in the Mishkan is very essential and informative for all of what we know about the laws of Shabbos and the malachos of Shabbos, well, therefore, we're going to do a deep dive and try to visualize what those wagons looked like, or more specifically, what the stuff on the wagons looked like, how they were arranged, how they were stacked, and how that interplayed with the public domain wherein they stood. And so that's really going to be the bulk of today's discussion. We're going to imagine there's going to be some questions about math, how to stack things, stuff that I'll need those that are engineering and mathematically inclined to assist. And I must confess, although I study the Torah portions that describe the tabernacle, and there's two of them or multiple parshas every year, and it comes up in different places in the Gemara, it's an area that I struggle a bit with the exact, mechanics and the exact engineering of it. And so this Gemara will be an opportunity to revisit, and I'm going to lean on our folks here that are more inclined to that, and perhaps you've already considered these discussions. And so with that, let's share the screen, and we're going to be dedicating our learning for the good circumstance, well-being of all the dear members of our Chabura and their households, and the names that we've posted and continue to post on our group, with prayerful wishes for a complete and speedy recovery, and good news for all of Klal Yisrael. And we'll say a coffee l'chaim for an abundance of good news for all.
Rabbi, there was one question I wanted to ask.
Go ahead.
Before we start. Was the Mishkan built especially for the laws of Shabbos, to teach us the laws of Shabbos?
No.
Or was it built for another purpose?
The Mishkan was built with all different creative forms of construction and craftsmanship. Those, however, become highly informative because that becomes the basic outline of malachos that existed in those days. And also because there's a limud in the Torah where the Torah juxtaposes a number of times the Mishkan and Shabbos. And so we understand that the activities of the Mishkan are highly informative about the nature of what is considered a malacha. You ask a good question. I wouldn't suppose that each of the steps were done in order to inform laws of Shabbos, but it was kind of in a natural and obvious relationship for the most part. But there is a little bit of I don't want to use the word irrational, but there's a little bit of a super rational gzeras hakasav, because that's how it is, aspect to this discussion. With Hashem's help, as we continue to work through Masechah Shabbos, we will have additional perspective on exactly your question, the relationship, the dynamic between the Mishkan and the laws of Shabbos. It's a very good question, and I hope I gave some context or some perspective.
You sure did.
Thank you.
I think that in the instructions for building the Mishkan, there was the warning to keep the Shabbos, and
Yes.
the interpretation was that it was made to make sure that Mishkan is not built on Shabbos. That is the relationship between the Mishkan and Shabbos, between Shabbos laws and Mishkan is just to list the works that malachot that were performed outside of Shabbos on weekdays.
Indeed, and that's one of the primary places where we find that juxtaposition, where they said whatever you do, don't do the whole Mishkan work to create on Shabbos, and there are other places as well, and so it's a little bit. It is a logical. There is a logical side to it. The tasks of building the Mishkan were the tasks that the Jewish people were highly familiar with, but there is also again, I would maintain a super rational, just because that's what Hashem decreed aspect
Rabbi,
to the discussion. Yes.
At this point, to ask this question, it might be a bit weird. Why are we so focused on what and how they did things at the Mishkan? We have midoraisa that we shouldn't work.
I'll tell you why, because what is the definition of we shouldn't work?
But
We shouldn't do melacha.
why go to this particular point? I mean, if you try to think, I hate
Laura
to
Beryl,
use rationally.
Let me interrupt you for a moment. If I would tell you, Beryl, don't work, what does that mean?
Well, the obvious thing rationally is, digging
Go to your
holes,
job.
et cetera, et cetera.
No, the rational thing in 2022 would be don't go to your work, or don't go on your don't trade your stocks, or don't go onto your Zoom meeting for consulting, or I don't know, or because you don't join the board of directors. That would be what you think don't work.
You just gave a terrific example. You're proving my point. What in the Mishkan would we learn about trading stocks?
But therefore, the Torah gives us a statement: don't do melacha, and we use explicitly that very word melacha to describe the acts of the Mishkan. And that becomes our source for malachas. I honestly don't understand your question.
Okay, so my question is the following. If I want to trade stocks on Shabbos, what part of the work on the Mishkan could you tell me this allows me to do it?
So, Raberel, at the close of Masechah Shabbos, we will have to revisit your question, and any given activity that we understand to be prohibited, we have to ask the question, does this fit into one of the 39 malachas? Or does this sound like something that the prophet Jeremiah instructs the Jewish people to avoid, that has more of a, I don't want to call it rabbinic, but we call it midivrei Kabbalah from the prophets? Or does it fit one of the rabbinic enactments? And if we can draw no connection between an activity and the biblical, prophetic, or rabbinic tradition, well, then most likely it is permissible. And so Rabbi, your question is, yes.
This is a moot question because HaKadosh Baruch Hu knew this would happen, and there's Hashgacha Pratit, and the stock market, New York Stock Exchange, closes at 4 o'clock. Shabbos never starts before 4 o'clock, and it's closed on Shabbos and on Sunday for that matter. So there you go.
Well, Dr. Hammer, what if you live in New Zealand and you want to trade American stocks?
We're talking,
it's Sunday.
We're ethnocentric.
I guess.
Rabbi, can I interrupt?
4 o'clock someplace in the world.
Yeah.
Dr. Hammer, that's a
Can
good
I
answer.
interrupt 1 second?
Yes. And hold on, Doctor, and that's how we know that finance is run by the Jews. Okay.
Right.
Rabbi, I guess
but no one knows you could trade Bitcoin and currency exchange 24/7.
Of course, you can do anything 24/7.
You can do anything 24/7.
So it's open all day and all night, Bitcoin.
But the original was in Bereshis, Vayanach Vayom HaShvi, God rested and stopped doing his work. So what was his work? Was creation. So that's why we have also an element of creation besides actual work. So
and Doctor, take it a step further, and that's exactly why we're always picking on Hoitzah, because Malacha almost always, in the context of creation, and the Mishkan is creative, with the exception of Hoitzah, and that's why Tosfos keeps on saying this is a Malacha Grua, this is a disappointing Malacha. That's exactly why, because it's the only Malacha that's really not creative or constructive in the conventional sense, and that's why our Gemara is so consumed with proving every facet directly from the Mishkan, because otherwise our instinct would be to reject Haitzah. But indeed, that is the point. That is the point. So what is the formula? Yes.
I think at the end of my question is referring back to the Mishkan an attempt to give us less things to do or more things to be allowed?
Neither. It's an attempt to clarify. That's all it is. It's not an attempt to give more. It's not an attempt to give less. When Moshe Rabbeinu told the Jewish people, for the name of God on Mount Sinai, don't do malacha, and then he elaborated after he came down the mountain, after or during the instruction to build a Mishkan, he says, Rabbi Sai, check this out. You want to know what you can't do on Shabbos? Well, come. You know, everyone likes to stop and watch construction. He said, come gather around, watch this malacha. Everything you see here, well, that's the cheat sheet. That's what you can't be doing. No weaving, no cooking, no gathering, no harvesting. And then he said, guys, I know you're going to have this, you're going to find this hard to believe, but it even means not to carry stuff from one domain to the other or for Amos in a public domain. But that, again, there's no space. It doesn't say in the Torah explicitly that this event happened, but that's essentially what happened. And so from the beginning of the commandment to the Jewish people to observe the Shabbos, or certainly following the Matan Torah, that was the instruction.
Rabbi,
now,
the instruction, I'm sorry to interrupt, were for the Jewish people, correct?
Correct.
So now we get into the issue, whether it's construction or other things, where we are able to, in the proper way, ask or pay for a non-Jew to do things that we are not allowed to do. How does that relate to the Mishkan now?
So you're asking a very good question, and I'm going to avoid it just because it's a little bit complex. This is the question you're asking about: how and when, if and why are we generally discouraged from instructing a Gentile who is not instructed to observe Shabbos? And the short answer is that it's possibly rabbinic, but the Chazal tell us that we're not supposed to have a Gentile do malacha in our agency or in our representation. It's possible, and again, I'm very cautious here because there's a lot of scholarship and we haven't gotten there yet. But it's possible that biblically it may have been permitted. I'm not saying that it was, but it's possible that it was. But suffice it to say, it's a good question. And let's go back to the Mishkan, because we're never gonna. I don't want to say never, but today's a great day. No. You're asking a good question, but I'll tell you, I think the premise of your question comes. I mean, yeah, I'm not saying this in a critical way, but it's coming from the perspective that at a later date we decided to create an association between the Mishkan and an instruction not to work. And so we're wondering, why do we choose this? Could there have been a more exacting standard or a more relaxed standard? Why was this the standard? And so I'm just telling you that the Torah lechatchila, with the combination of the written and oral tradition, I believe from the outset, at least according to the opinions, because there are multiple opinions for the source of the malacha. So I want to leave room for other opinions in the Gemara, but suffice it to say, in as much as the Mishkan is the source of al malacha, well, then it came at the very moment of the instruction. Doctor?
I don't want to confound it, but what was in my mind was really kind of weird. It had to do with the issue of a kinyan, and it had to do with the issue of the practice, whether it's halachically acceptable or whatever, of Jews who own businesses selling their business for Shabbos and Yantiv to non-Jews and then getting it back the way we do with chametz, erzatz, or whatever. So that's what was in my mind with the Mishkan and with all of this. There are all of these issues which are in a way related, I believe, to doing malacha on Shabbos.
So first of all, I want to first of all correct myself. There are facets, there are parts of Shabbos, things that we don't do very, very vigorously and emphatically, that you'll be surprised to discover are actually not in the Bible or not prohibited from the Bible itself. Certain aspects of commerce that are not biblically prohibited. and they're only either rabbinic or, and I misspoke, I said Yirmiyahu, but I meant Yeshaya, Isaiah. As a matter of fact, we've taken the detail already, so let's take it a step further. Liturgy, Siddur. Okay, I'm going to assume that this is somewhat universal. We need to look for Kiddush. Where am I going to find Kiddush? Shabbos, daytime meal, Kiddusha Rabbah. Let's get us some English. I just want to show you. There's another, we can go straight to Isaiah if we need to, but I'm going to have to
Rabbi,
do that.
while you're looking, I'd like to bring something up also. The purpose of work, or the expression of work, is wrong, because it includes a lot of things. If it would just be limited to work, then we'd be building fires and we'd be turning on switches and electricity and driving cars.
Exactly,
and
it's not work.
Things in our pockets.
Exactly. I started making the point and I stopped and I cut myself off. You are correct. Melacha, the prohibition of Shabbos, is not work per se. It's melacha. It's creative labor. It's very specific. And so hypothetically, not that you should do this, you shouldn't do this, but a person that is a guard, well, quite possibly a guard would be allowed to show up to their post. And if you're a manager or a foreman, maybe you could also do that. And if you're a lawyer, hypothetically, I'm not saying you should do this, but hypothetically, there may be ways to do your work without doing melacha.
It goes even deeper. Some of the things that are prohibited makes us avoid work.
Well, no, that would be a continuation. Admittedly, much of work, and certainly in the ancient times, work is almost entirely synonymous with melacha. All we're saying is it's not identical. And for that reason, hypothetically, there are work that's not melacha. There are jobs, I should say, that are not melacha. And there are non-jobs, there are sitting at home that is melacha. And it's why many people who are first introduced to Shabbos struggle to understand why you're not allowed to watch a college football game drinking a beer and, play and FaceTiming your family on Shabbos. That's the epitome of relaxation and not to work. But the answer is it's not about work. Again, the specific examples, let's hold off on nitpicking, but that's a very good point from our kohen here. So this is a passage that you may be familiar. I'm not sure if every siddur has it, but certainly the Chabad, and I'm sure others as well, quote from Isaiah. This is the prophet Isaiah. And he talks about if you refrain from trampling, the Gemara is going to bring this up, and it's brought up in the Shulchan Aruch. I'm just showing it here because we've already come here. You refrain from trampling the Shabbos, from pursuing your affairs on my holy day. If you call the Shabbos delight, the Lord's holy day honored, and if you honor it and go not your ways, nor look to your affairs, nor strike bargains, then you'll seek the favor of the Lord. I'll set you astride on the heights of the earth. You can enjoy the heritage of your father Jacob, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. And so here is a prophet telling the Jewish people how to observe Shabbos, and it is understood frequently within in Shulchan Aruch and in the Gemara that here may be the earliest explicit source restricting not just melacha but also business interests. I don't want to go beyond this because I want to let the Gemara teach us in the right time, and I also. But anyways, there you have it.
Rabbi, I just want to point out that you're on tape suggesting that one should not drink beer on Shabbos. I just don't want to take it out of context. But that might come back. My words have someday to haunt you, Rabbi.
My words have been taken out of. Actually, and really, what I should have said is you shouldn't hold the remote flipping channels.
Right, but not the drinking. The drinking. Okay.
Yeah. Anyways, the bottom line is like this. There's a lot more to learn. Let's try to cover a little bit of ground. Now I'm not sure we're going to get through it, but I'm going to need your help. So let's jump into the board meeting. All right. Tada Rabbanan. Hazorik meshus rabim l'shus rabim. If you throw something from one domain to another domain, Reshus hayachid be'emtza, and in the middle there is a Reshus hayachid. This sounds very familiar. Arba amois. If there's arba amos, if there's 4 amos involved, chayiv, he's chayiv. What's going on over here? Isn't this obvious? What's the chiddush? So the answer is, and if we see, it's actually very interesting. And Rashi points this out, and the Gemara points this out. Suppose you throw something from one public domain to the other public domain. But in the aggregate, you've caused the item to travel less than 4 amot. And suppose you don't believe that there's any melacha of hotzah or hachnasa just by causing something to fly through the airspace of a private domain. Because let's say you don't believe kiluta k'mashahuncha, that when something enters into the airspace, it's as if it's on the ground of that airspace. Well, then the only problem would be 4 amis, havara. And so here he says, arba amis, there needs to be 4 amis in the aggregate collectively between the 2 public domains in order to be chayiv. Rashi, im avar b'rshus harabim dalar amis, afilu al yedei tziruf, even if it means combining 2 different public domains, chayiv, the Brisa teaches us you're chayiv. And that's a little bit of a chiddush. I might think that the moment it enters into the private domain, well then, that deletes, that erases the fraction 2 amis or whatever that it's traveled. And then when it goes into the next public domain, it's a new severed trip, and it's less than 4 amis. So this Brisa tells us no. Indeed, it is considered that you threw it chayiv. He's chayiv. However, we turn the page now to 98a. That's Sadik Chesamad Aleph. Pachas me'arba amis. If collectively, in the aggregate, there are less than 4 amis, pator, you are exempt. Rashi. It's not considered that he caused it to travel from one domain to the other. Because the author of this Brisa does not accept that it's as if we look at it on the ground. We see that it's still in journey, it's still traveling. So the Gemara says, "My kamashman, what's the chiddush here? Ha kamashman, this is a chiddush. Rishuyot mitzdarfot, 2 different domains can combine to cause a person to be chayiv." Rashi says, "Rishuyos hashavos." If it's the same status of a domain, but it's 2 different domains, they can combine. Udelamrina and klutak mashahuncha, and we do not state that klutak mashahuncha, that if it travels through the airspace, it's as if it is on the ground and it's landed. It's come to rest. Rashi mitzdarfos, reshus ramzu, im reshus ramzu, one public domain with the other. Udelakar Rabbi Yossi, and this is not in accordance to the opinion expressed earlier on in our Gemara by Rabbi Yossi, who says, here he says, if you're combining 2 different domains, you're potter. Long story short, 2 domains combine, and we are not concerned by the private domain in middle, because all we look at is the starting point, the end point, and we're not looking at what happens in the middle. Certainly not for the
Was there a difference between something caught and something?
I'm sorry, go again. Is there a difference between something?
Why is there? It says klutam is something that is caught rather than placed.
No, so kluta here, it doesn't mean the translation, at least the way the Gemara used it, doesn't mean that it's caught. It means if it's suspending or if it's floating through the air, if it's in the air.
Got you. Okay.
Do we imagine, what is the relationship between something in the air and the ground beneath it? So there is a halachic theory that some of the rabbis of the Gemara say, which is airspace is nothing. There's nothing. It's just air. It's empty. And therefore, we just imagine that it's on the ground. And so if it passes into an area where had it been on the ground, you'd be chayiv. But we imagine, again, it's kind of like we might use the word a legal fiction. The eye of halacha perceives that it's on the ground to make you chayiv. But this Brisa strongly tells us that is not the case. If it's traveling through the airspace, we don't consider that it's actually, in other words, what is the relationship with something passing through the air and the land beneath it? We might even make the case that klutu k'mashoncha means we don't really believe in the relationship of airspace or air rights and the land beneath it. Because it passes through the air, it doesn't mean that it's related to what's below. Rebel, you wanted to say something?
I don't remember if I touched on this point. What if a person intends to throw it more than 4 amos, and then it hits something and falls in less than 4 amos? Is he potter?
Well, you're certainly not going to be chayav for that which you didn't do. Even you're saying, what if someone saves you? What if, Beryl, you're standing in the private domain and you want to throw your football and you want to throw it into the street where your friend is standing? That would be a terrible malacha. And so your dear friend on the opposing team gets up and stuffs you. He knocks the ball out of you. He intercepts it. So is an interception, are you chayiv because it was intercepted? I'm sorry, are you chayiv because you intended for it to go, or did the interception, so your opponent saves you? And the answer, of course, is you're not going to be chayiv for that which you didn't do, even if your intention was to do a malacha. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no teshuvah to do for intending to do a malacha, but that's a different story. Again, back to Professor, again, we're going back to those sports analogies.
What is suspended in mid-air mean? I mean, I understand what you're saying, that it's not chayav, but what does suspension mean? If somebody catches something, since it didn't reach the ground, does that mean suspended? Or nothing is suspended and stays suspended?
Suspended doesn't really mean suspended, because when it's moving, it's not suspended. But in the moment, it's over a space. And so if you freeze the frame, it's right now hanging over a private domain. What's the relationship to the ground below? And so Kaluta Kmashuncha says we freeze the frame, and if it's in the air, we just envision that it's rolling on the ground or it's landed on the ground for the purposes of liability on Shabbos, because you've caused the item to enter into the private domain. Our Gemara says, no, we don't say Kaluta Kmashuncha. If it's traveling through the air, it's in motion, it's not stopping, and therefore it has a very limited or non-halachic relationship with the land below it, certainly to not be considered chayiv for causing an item to travel from one point A to point B on Shabbos. Again, there's a lot more scholarship in the Achronim, but let's keep it somewhat simple here. And so this teaching is a little bit of an island unto itself, and we're now going to be introduced to another halacha, which is going to trigger our discussion about the wagons, on Shabbos. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda, Amar Rav Abba, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav. Wow. So this is a tradition where we've really done a good job preserving the chain of custody, or the chain of who passed it, who taught it. So Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda conveyed to the Gemara in the name of Rav Abba, in the name of Rav Huna, in the name of Rav. So this is a teaching that originates with Rav, who taught as follows, and I think we saw this before, but let's see it again. Hamavir arba amis b'shus harabim. If you carry something in a space, ostensibly we would consider it to be a public domain, but mikora, it has a roof over it. Hator, the person is exempt. Why, says Rav? Lefi she'eino doma lediglei midbar. The act of carrying in a public space that has a roof is not the act of carrying in the public domain that happened in the time of the Mishkan, in the generation of the Midbar. And because there is an absolute relationship between the malachas as they were in the Mishkan and that which is prohibited, and this does not reflect that malacha, therefore patur. That's a strong statement. Basically, in the eye of halacha, a public space that has a roof is not a public space. For the purposes of Hilchos Shabbos, it is I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it is not a public domain. There's a lot to discuss.
Carmelite would be a...
What?
It'd be a Carmelite, I guess, right?
We have to think of it. I guess so.
You can't have a roof without a structure.
There's all different ways, but let's ostensibly there is a structure, but let's take it.
Carmelite should be accessible for walking, but the roof ostensibly is not, so it's something different.
Doctor, go ahead. Oh.
And I'm not sure what it is.
I'm sorry. I zoned out. Professor, what are you saying?
I said that I thought that the Carmelite is something where people could walk, but the roof is not designed so that people would walk on it, or people wouldn't want to walk on it. It's not
right.
It's not a commonly accessible place
right.
of walking.
Yes, I'm not in this moment. I'm not sure how we would define its halachic status. But what we can say with certainty is it's not a public domain, and so The Gemara is Rav is staking the position that one would not be biblically liable for carrying 4 amas in a public domain if there was a roof on top of it. Let's suspend further commentary, but that is what he's saying. So if you're playing football or soccer or whatever it is, and it's a area that has a overhang or roofing of some sorts, according to Rav, perhaps this would not be a biblical act of mavir, even though you're carrying the ball 4 amas. Or carrying the item. I just want to show you the Rambam. He, in the very beginning of chapter 14, where he discusses the domains. So he mentions that there are 4 types of domains. And in his definition of a public domain, here's what he says. A zu hi rishus harabim. Tell me what a rishus harabim is. Here's what it is. Midbarot, deserts, ayarot, cities, shvakim, marketplaces, udrachim hamufulashim lahem, and the roadways that are interconnected with these spaces. Bilvad, there's another condition that could make or break the public domain status. If it's a walkway, a road, it has to be 16 amot wide, which is a pretty wide space. Mark, what is 16 amos? How many feet?
24 feet.
Approximately 24 feet. Something between 20 to 30 feet, 20 to 25 feet.
Yeah, 24. I mean, I can look it up in the.
Okay. All right. We'll need you even more soon. So I don't want to burn you out yet. Velo, and here's the punchline. Velo yihya alav tikra. But there cannot be a roof upon it. To be considered a biblical rishus harabim, and for all the consequences associated. What?
7.68 meters according to the.
Which is how many feet?
At the right, you go to the other app that converts in meters to
24 feet.
All right, I'm gonna take Alan's word for it. 24 feet.
Take his word. Canada's in metric.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying. I take a person who lives by metrics. I'll take their.
I think amma is very similar to feet in size.
What exactly does the reshut of Mekom Ptor mean?
30
actually
centimeters.
25 feet.
Let's
Good enough.
not go there now because that's not in the moment. In the very beginning of the Masechta, we did spend a little time. It has the dimensions that would not designate it to be a private domain or a public domain. It has the wrong or right dimensions. But let's if you don't mind, let's hold off on that for the moment.
No problem.
So mostly most roadways are 25 feet wide.
Most
That's the really
are
narrow
not.
path.
Well, the 95 is, South Ocean Drive is, right?
25
Seacrest-
feet would be 3 lanes, I guess. Or probably
Seacrest-
more.
How many lanes? 4 lanes?
The lane 8 is a lane 8 feet wide, or no? Lane's probably 10 feet wide.
Depends which municipality
10 where?
and who's
And a little side street, maybe not. You know, like in
you're
a
driving on a
little-
mountain on these mountain passes. You certainly you halavai. You wish you'll get to get a few extra feet. Okay, so I just want to show you something here. The Shulchan Aruch says, and again, maybe we're jumping the gun. Ezoi Carmelis, and he goes through a whole bunch of things. And one of the things he adds over here, Rishus Harabim, Shimikoira. So it seems like certainly the Shulchan Aruch is taking the position that it is actually that it would be considered a Carmelis, which sounds like the reasonable answer, reflects the instinct of our Chabura. And so we'll leave it at that for now.
According to the Google, an average lane on a road is 12 feet wide.
12 feet. So a 2-lane highway might be,
Yeah, it might
but
be
there
enough.
are other criteria too. It's not just the size. That's one of the criteria.
At least that's on the interstates anyway.
Yeah. Well, first, I think the interstates have a larger. Oh, here, okay.
Here it says a rural could be 10 to 12. Yeah, because it has to be at least 10 though. Because trucks and things like RVs are usually 8 feet wide. I think that's the maximum they allow. You got to have a little bit of space.
Yeah, because again, a Carmelis means a space that is not a private domain, but doesn't meet all the criteria to be a public domain. And so that sounds like that is we'll stick with that definition. So the Gemara at this point makes the statement that in the Mishkan, in the desert, there was no such thing as a public domain that had a roof, and therefore it's not a public domain, halachically speaking. It is considered a private domain. The Gemara is going to challenge this strongly. Amy, is that really an accurate statement, says the Gemara? Is this true? Are you really comfortable with this answer? Is that your final answer? We do find a roofed area in the public domain in the desert, which, if that's so, well, then we should consider carrying, even in a rooftop space, as a Rishus Harab. Ini, is this true? There were wagons in the Mishkan that were Mikorot, Rashi, Hagalos, the Mishkan, Hagalos that carried the parts of the Mishkan were roofed. They had roofing. They were covered. How so? Rashi, Bekrushim, Hasudurim, Alehem. We had the beams, the boards that were set up on the wagons. Rachvan, the width of the beams were aligned. Le'orech ha'agala, the width ran to the length of the wagon. Ve'orkan le'rachban, and the length of the beams went across the width. Al rosh dafnotel ve'kasal kadaitach al pnei kol orech hagalot ha'misdor. So if the wagon has these long beams running the length of the beams across the width of the wagon, well, essentially it means that there's part of this load is spreading out into the public domain. And now we have Rishus Harabim that has a roofing over it, these beams that are now like roofing over the public domain. And if that's the case, it existed. And if that's the case, one should be precluded from carrying in a public domain that has roofing. The Amar here. Ini the Agalois, the Mekayre Savin. In truth, the wagons that carried the beams of the Mishkan were Mekorot, they had roofs. How so? The Amar Av Mishum Rechia, Agalot, the wagons that existed in the Mishkan. Tachteihen, underneath them, Uveineihem, and between them, Mitzideim, and their sides, Rishus Ha-Rabim. That was all considered a public domain. And so we have Rav contradicting Rav. Rav on one hand says there is no such thing as a public domain. And we also have Rav quoting his uncle and mentor, Achia, saying that there was a public domain. What are we going to do about this? Let's read some more Rashis. Then we'll take a sneak peek at some of the pictures that I posted in the group and online, and we'll see if we can start to make sense of our discussion about the boards. Again, the Mikorot Havan Bekrash Mastur Alem Rachman Rachada. We have the long beams across the width. So imagine you have a pickup truck. You have the bed of the pickup truck, and you, instead of aligning your beams, the length, it runs across the top, and so you have big pieces of wood extending on both sides of the pickup truck. It's not a great analogy, but it's a starting point. Ubeinehem, bein agala la'agala, between one wagon and the other, shebetzida, ve'afal pi she'roshei kroshim yotzim lekan ulekan, although the beams extend into those in-between spaces, how much? Shtei amot u'mechsel lechol ruach. You have 2.5 amot going over the wagons in every direction. Ve'roshei kroshim shel agala zu, and the edges, the points, top and bottom of the beams that were on one wagon, Magian L'Roshei Kroshim Shalzu, they almost entirely reached one another. Shabbatzida, how so? We're going to read Rashi and then we're going to look at the pictures and hopefully the diagrams, and hopefully it'll give us a lot more clarity. But bear with me. Shaharei, Chamesh Amot Hayu Bein Agala L'Agala. Each wagon was aligned with a 5 amma gap. Kidul Kaman, as the Gemara is going to describe. Each wagon was the width of 5 amas. So the pickup truck bed was 5 amas wide. Hacholol shtei amos umechsa. And so
the length of the crossing was 10 amos,
yeah,
5 amos within the agala, and 2.5
and 2.5
amos
on each side.
So I have a
Yeah.
total of 10 amos.
Yes, that's what we're saying. The boards themselves were 2.5 amos and 10 amos long. And so when the length was aligned according to the width of the wagons, you have 2.5 amos both to mikol sad. As the doctor just said, Nimso, again, here's the bottom line, Beis amos umechsa, both to mikol sad, the Nimso revach shebein shtei agalais mekaira b'rashei krashim. So it turns out you have 2 wagons parked alongside each other, 5 amos in the middle, and the beams run across, and you have this perfectly roofed space. Now, please bring in the images.
Rabbi, are we to assume that everybody agrees that those were the exact measurements?
Beryl, you're asking a good question, but the Gemara is unfolding, and so of course there's not going to be we're not going to have a total consensus. But we first need to visualize the scenario being presented to us before we consider the next scenario. Good question. In other words, yes, we'll find out that there are other possibilities. I'm just trying to find the correct here. Unfortunately, it's how do I hold on? I'm gonna have to save the image. Desktop, downloads, save. Let's see if they'll let me open it now. Failed network, that's no good. Let's try it again.
That's from the parking lot.
Failed net. Okay, they're not. All right, we're just gonna have to turn our heads over here, but let's take a look. You see what's happening here? You see those wheels? That's the width of the wagon, one wheel to the other. And here is the bed of the wagon itself, which is 2.5 amos wide. But including the wheels, actually, there might be a better picture. All right, we're adding more information here than I intended. Let me just see if this is going to work.
Why can't we say that the wheels were under the wagon? The wagon was 5 amos wide. The wheels were under. Why do we have to?
We can't say anything. We can't say anything. Hold on, we can't say anything because the Gemara. Well, that's why I'm trying to find you the right diagram. The Gemara and the Rashi. I'm just trying to make sure we have the right image.
That sure doesn't look very stable. It's not balanced because the end is not as much weight as the other side.
Hang on. I'm showing you the wrong.
It's a four-wheel drive. I'm always amazed at the level these rabbis were at to come and say this is the measurement to the inch. It's amazing to me at the level they were at.
Well, they had these traditions, and it seems to work out. You can build out the scenarios. I don't know why it amazes you. As long as if what you're reading is real, then you have to visualize it on paper. And once you visualize it on paper, you can figure out we have tradition about the size of the wagons. We have tradition about the size of the beams, and all that's left for us to do is to arrange and rearrange until we come to the truth of the matter. So this is where we're going to start. So the shaded area, this is a stack of beams, and their total width is 10 amos. And the same thing with the wagon next door to it, 10 amos. And so at this point, we are asserting with certainty that the wagon, along with the extending wheels and whatever else that took up part of its space, right? So you can measure a car from the inside, from the cabin, but you could also measure from the outside. So essentially, the two measurements we have here are the bed, the actual bed of the car, and then we have the total space. And so here we have 5 amot. The exact breakdown, which is based on Rashi, is 2.5 for the bed itself, and then 1.25 for the wheels, which essentially equal 5. And then you have the protruding beams, 2.5 on each side, which equals 10. So this is the basic mathematics. Again, I'm sorry it's on its side, but this is the basic mathematics of what the Gemara, based on Rashi, is envisioning. And now you have this perfect space over here, which is approximately 5 amot in between the two wagons. This is a beautiful roofed-in public domain. How does Rav say there is no public domain? That is, in a nutshell, what's being said. By the way, I just want to show you, we have Rabbi Steinsaltz's pictures, which I chose not to show you because he doesn't make the same effort to portray for us the extent of how it's protruding over, but he shows us basically two wagons alongside each other. No, I'm sorry. This is a later point in the Gemara. I don't know if he gives me
sharing the wagon.
Yeah, it's a later point in the Gemara. So let me see if he gives us any images.
For some I don't see. It seems like there's not enough bed for the width of the boards though. Or the length of the boards.
Let's see. The Gemara is going to get much more specific, which is why we're trying to keep it just a little bit vague because we're going to build in the details. Look at this. Tzideim is revach shebein doifan agalas, the wall of the wagon, leoifan v'oivia oifan, and the wheel and what the wheel takes up. So again, Rav says there's no roofed-in public domain, and Rav also says that there was a roofed-in public domain. Kikam Rav bidarasa. When Rav says that there was a place that is considered a roofed-in public, when he says that underneath the wagon is considered Rishus Rabim, he's talking about the Rasa. Let's see Rabbi Steinsaltz's translation. He's talking about when the beams were stacked. When Rav says that the space between the wagons had legal status of a public domain, he's talking about the beams that were stacked, and then there was space between the stacks. Rashi, we're talking about this space between the beams. Shahaya Sudar Keresh al Keresh. Seder echad umanicha revach, seder echad umanicha revach. You have stacks with space in between them. And so, when Rav says, so when he says tachteihem uvneihem etzidem rishus rabim, he means the part that wasn't roofed, because the part that was roofed is considered public. It was considered private domain. Again, by Rav saying that there is no status public domain, we must conclude he's talking about the open aired space. That's the Gemara's initial explanation.
Rabbi.
Yes.
So we now have another complete question. What's a roof? Covering with some.
Rebero, you're getting ahead of the Gemara. Why don't we let the Gemara first present? There's a lot of questions because we're in the middle of a narrative. So what is the halachic status of what's considered halachically roofed? That's exactly what's happening over here. Rav calls something a roof. What was he referring to? Actually, he doesn't call it a roof. He just says there's no such thing as a roof over a public domain. What does he mean? Does he mean it was non-existent, or does he mean that it didn't have the halachic status? So we need now to look at another picture, which I'm going to again struggle to get the right one.
Rabbi, these were all moved during Shabbos?
No, not at all. God forbid.
Okay, because
we're talking about malachas that happened in the weekday that were not allowed to be done on Shabbos that inform
us
of.
Because that wasn't clear. It sounds.
No, again, on Shabbos you're not allowed to do malacha. In the weekday, not only are you allowed to do malacha, you're supposed to do malacha. The Mishkan that we were instructed, as the professor said, to not do malacha on Shabbos. Those very acts that on the weekday are mitzvahs are prohibited on Shabbos, and by exploring them, we uncover the malachas that are not allowed to be done on Shabbos. Right. So now the Gemara says that Rav says that there's a gap, bidarasa, and Rabbi Steinsaltz translates as the space between the stacks. Rashi b'revach shebein shureis haseder. What space are we talking about? What gaps are we talking about? Here, if you line them up and you stack them, and we'll see the math in a moment, they don't cover the entire length of the wagon, because you stack them up with a certain amount of height in a certain way that allows us to have some kind of space, and that space is unroofed. And maybe that space is what's considered public domain. If you'll ask a question that the assertion was there is no roof, and the answer is about status, that's a good question. In other words, Rebel, your question now is a good question. Hold on, you just said there's no such thing as a roof, and that's why it's not considered a public domain. And now we're saying, actually, we could envision an area where there was a roof, but it is not considered a public domain. So was it a fact that there was no roofs, or is it a halachic fact that it's not considered a public domain? And if my question wasn't clear, leave it. But my point is that there's still a lot more to clarify. And we're in the middle of a moving process. So again, initially, Rav says there's no roofed area. Another statement he quotes from Rav Chia saying that there is an area that's considered a public domain. And when you say, yeah, the part that's not covered is considered a public domain. The part that's covered, it lost its public domain status. But there's a problem now. You know what the problem is? And we might have to stop here. Who remembers the word lavud? Dr. Stamler, what does lavud mean?
Something that extends.
In general, it's plywood.
In general, it's
It means attached.
halachically, it means that even if it's in fact not attached, we bridge the gap and we compress the empty space and we imagine it's not there. Halachic, I don't want to say imagine. The halachic fact is that space is insignificant, and so we consider them to be touching. Sometimes the gap is so small. I imagine this probably even applies in the modern days in code of construction. There's a certain size gap that's not considered a gap. Maybe on a deck or whatever, a certain gap. So halachically, this gap isn't considered empty space. It's considered part of the structure. And that's going to be a new question. I'm going to tell you the question outside. I think we're going to end here because we're going to have to come back and not revisit, but continue this process of imagining the wagons, figuring out the dimensions, how the items were stacked, and then applying it back to the laws of Shabbos. Suffice it to say, the gaps that we're imagining over here are minuscule. They are only a quarter of a tefach. Mark, what is a quarter of a tefach? Tefach?
That's not, is that, yeah.
I'm sorry, what is a quarter of an amma? How many tefachim is a quarter of an amma?
A quarter of an amma would be about, 3 inches? About one tefach, no? A little bit more.
One tefach, maybe, depending on if it's 5 or 6 tefachim, we're talking about, hold on, we can all agree less than 3 tefachim. Less than 3 tefachim, halachically, is lavud. We compress, it's not existent. If there's a hole in the roof, if there's a hole in the schach that's less than 3 tefachim, we imagine it doesn't exist. There's a hole in the floor, just a little crack that's non-existent. And so how can the Gemara make the claim on behalf of Rav that there was a gap and that's considered the unroofed public domain? That gap is so small, halachically, it doesn't exist. And that's going to be the next question of the Gemara. But I think we need to stop here because otherwise we'll
actually be, I guess that would be about 4.5 inches. Yeah, about a tefach and a half, I guess.
A tefach and a fraction or so. Well,
less than 3.
Yeah, a tefach and a fraction, less than 2 tefach. And so that's going to be the next question. And so the ensuing Gemara is going to, with the facts we have, play around with the different scenarios. I would consider this, we might imagine this to be a puzzle. And the challenge is to arrange it in a way that reflects different halachic priorities or different traditions about the layout of the Krashim on the Mishkan. And that's what we're going to be doing. It's not as confusing as I'm making it out to be, but with Hashem's help, we'll continue this fun on Sunday. And I want to thank you all for joining us. I want to wish everyone a wonderful Shabbos, and hope to see everyone on Sunday. On Sunday again, we're going to do I think maybe this will become a norm. I hope you'll, but let's try to do a 15-minute power session on Sunday. And so probably what we'll do is we'll spend our time just playing with the materials and the wagons and based on the Gemara's text. Roberto, go ahead.
Rabbi, it occurred to me going back to intention that there's a major philosophical discussions. One school holds that everything a human being does is in self-interest ultimately. And that somehow we're touching the same kind of thing here in our discussion.
You're saying even if a person declares that they're not interested, if they're doing it, they are interested.
Right. It's a major discussion. There's always self-interest involved.
All right. So in a future time, we could try to figure out if this can be projected into our Gemara's conversation, or if
The
it's
philosophers
not
have no solution either. Not to worry. Teku.
well, let's see how that applies to the Gemara's conception of machshava or malachas machshavas. Anyways, thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Good
And,
Shabbos.
Hope you see you. Take care.
Shabbos.